The sound of laughter and chatter echoed through our backyard, the night lit up by colorful pool lights shimmering in the water. I leaned against the patio railing, watching my wife, Claire, host the party effortlessly. She was always the life of the gathering, whether it was family or friends. This one was different, though. Our son Josh had turned 21, and we decided to throw him a birthday party, a milestone celebration. It was supposed to be a night of fun for everyone. I had no idea it was going to be the night everything would fall apart. I took a sip of my beer, scanning the crowd. Most of Josh's friends were around the pool, messing around in the jacuzzi, and a few were huddled near the outdoor bar. Josh was deep in conversation with his girlfriend, but something about the way he looked over his shoulder toward the jacuzzi made me uneasy. I noticed that Claire had drifted toward the same area, chatting and laughing with a few of Josh's buddies. It wasn't that I didn't trust her. We had been married for 23 years, and though our relationship had its ups and downs, I had never questioned her loyalty, until recently. For the past few months, Claire had been distant. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things, her staying out later, being engrossed in her phone more often, and seeming unusually detached during conversations. I chalked it up to stress. She had started a new job and was juggling a lot of responsibilities, but something still felt off. I had brushed away the nagging thoughts, convincing myself I was being paranoid. Tonight, though, as she laughed a little too freely with those young guys, I felt that same unease creep back. "Hey man, you good?" Josh's voice startled me. He had come up behind me, smiling but with a furrowed brow. "Yeah, just tired," I lied, giving him a quick smile. I didn't want to ruin his night with my concerns. "You should chill, have fun. Mom's doing a great job keeping everyone entertained." He winked and headed back toward his friends. I followed his gaze, watching Claire sit on the edge of the jacuzzi, her legs dangling in the water. One of Josh's friends, Brandon, I think his name was, had his arm casually draped over the side, dangerously close to her. My fists clenched, but I forced myself to relax. Claire was just being her usual friendly self. That's what I told myself, anyway. As the night wore on, the guests started thinning out. People left in groups, saying their goodbyes. I decided to start cleaning up, giving Claire a nod as I grabbed a trash bag. "I'll take care of the cups and plates," I called out, but she barely acknowledged me, engrossed in conversation with Brandon and another one of Josh's friends, Derek. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right, but I tried to ignore it. I wanted to believe it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Besides, what could really happen at a party like this? Everyone was around, and there wasn't much privacy. It was after midnight when things started to feel even stranger. Josh was nowhere to be found, having disappeared inside with his girlfriend, leaving Claire still outside with a few of his remaining friends. I wandered inside to grab a fresh trash bag when I overheard hushed voices from the open patio door. "Do you think he suspects anything?" one of them said, their voice low. "Nah, he's clueless," another voice responded, followed by a familiar laugh, Claire's laugh. My heart raced as I stepped back into the shadows, listening intently. What the hell were they talking about? I felt like I was eavesdropping on something I wasn't supposed to hear, and every fiber of my being told me to stop, to pretend I didn't hear anything. But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was unfolding right under my nose. Curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly crept toward the patio door. I peeked outside, my breath catching in my throat. Claire was sitting in the jacuzzi now, completely soaked, her hair wet and clinging to her shoulders. The two guys, Brandon and Derek, were sitting on either side of her, laughing and drinking way too close for comfort. I clenched my fists again, trying to stay calm, but the sight of them there, so casual and intimate, sent alarm bells ringing in my head. I couldn't hear what they were saying anymore, but I knew I couldn't let this go on. I tossed the trash bag aside and stepped out onto the patio, my footsteps loud enough to announce my presence. They all looked up at me startled. Claire flashed me a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Hey honey, everything okay?" she asked, her voice light, as if nothing was wrong. I forced a smile, even though my blood was boiling. "Yeah, just checking in. It's getting late, don't you think?" Brandon and Derek exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. They didn't say anything, but the tension in the air was thick. Claire, on the other hand, seemed unbothered by the awkwardness. She stood up, the water from the jacuzzi dripping down her legs, and walked over to me, placing a hand on my arm. "Relax, babe. We're just having fun." She kissed my cheek, her breath smelling faintly of alcohol. I nodded stiffly, but the unease wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was going on, something that I wasn't seeing yet. As the night continued, I resolved to keep a close eye on everything. My gut told me this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The party had all but fizzled out. The house was quiet now, except for the occasional laughter and muffled voices coming from the backyard. Most of Josh's friends had left, but a few of them, Brandon, Derek, and a couple of others, lingered, clearly intoxicated. I busied myself with tidying up, trying to distract from the gnawing feeling in my gut. Claire was still out by the jacuzzi, far too comfortable with those boys. Something was off, and the more I tried to ignore it, the harder it became. As I threw another empty beer can into the trash, I noticed Josh stumbling toward me from the hallway, his girlfriend helping him walk. "I think he had a bit too much," she said with an awkward smile. I chuckled, trying to mask my unease. "He'll be fine. Get him upstairs, make sure he's got some water." She nodded, and together they disappeared up the stairs. With Josh out of the picture, I realized something. It was just me, Claire, and the remnants of his friends left in the backyard. And it wasn't sitting well with me at all. I stepped back outside, hoping to get Claire to come inside, but when I did, the scene that greeted me made my blood run cold. There they were, Brandon, Derek, and Claire, sitting in the jacuzzi. But now, it wasn't just casual conversation or playful laughter. The way Brandon had his arm around her waist, pulling her closer, wasn't innocent. Derek's hand was on her thigh, inching upward with a confidence that made my skin crawl. And Claire? She didn't resist. She leaned in, laughing as if she didn't have a husband of 23 years standing just a few feet away. I froze, unable to move, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. This wasn't the woman I married, the woman I loved. This couldn't be happening. My chest tightened, my breath shallow, and the world seemed to blur around me. Claire whispered something to Brandon, something that made him laugh. Then, without a second thought, she leaned in and kissed him. Right in front of me. Not just a peck, a full, deep kiss that made my stomach turn. The world stopped spinning for a moment, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. My vision tunneled as anger and betrayal surged through me like a tidal wave. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to drag those punks out of my house. But I was rooted to the spot, stunned by the sheer audacity of what was unfolding before me. Derek leaned in closer now, his hands moving more freely over Claire's body. Her eyes fluttered shut as she welcomed his touch. They were oblivious to my presence, or maybe they didn't care. My mind raced, trying to make sense of this nightmare. What had changed? How had I not seen the signs? The late nights, the constant phone calls, her distance, all the pieces were falling into place. She had been slipping away for months, and I had let it happen. But this was beyond anything I could have imagined. Then, as if to pour salt into the wound, Claire let out a low moan, and my fists clenched at my sides. I couldn't watch anymore. Rage boiled inside me, pushing me past the point of no return. I had to stop this now. I stepped forward, my voice low and shaking with barely contained fury. "Claire." The three of them jolted in surprise, turning to face me. Claire's eyes went wide with shock, but not regret. She quickly scrambled out of the jacuzzi, grabbing a towel to cover herself. "Babe, it's not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice unconvincing, eyes darting between me and the two guys in the water. "Not what it looks like?" I hissed, barely able to control my anger. "You're in a hot tub with our son's friends, making out with them. What exactly am I supposed to think?" Derek and Brandon shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what to do. But I wasn't focused on them. My eyes were locked on Claire, waiting for an explanation that would somehow make sense of the betrayal I had just witnessed. She stepped closer, her hands reaching out for me, but I pulled back, disgusted. "Please, just let me explain." "Explain what?" I barked. "That you've been cheating on me? With them." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She couldn't even deny it. And that was it. That was all I needed. Something snapped inside me, and all the emotions I had been holding back came flooding out in a violent torrent. I turned my gaze toward Brandon and Derek, who were still sitting in the jacuzzi, looking like they wanted to be anywhere else but here. I stormed toward the garage, my mind a whirlwind of rage. As I threw open the door, my eyes landed on a piece of rebar leaning against the wall, left over from a repair project I'd been working on a few weeks ago. Without thinking, I grabbed it, the weight of it grounding me as I stormed back toward the backyard. Claire was standing there, her hands wringing the towel as she begged me to calm down. But I was beyond calming down. My focus was on those two idiots still in the water. "You think this is a joke?" I growled, the rebar clenched tightly in my hand. "You think you can just come into my house and disrespect me like this?" Brandon stood up first, his hands raised in surrender. "Look man, we didn't mean..." Before he could finish, I swung the rebar, the metal crashing into the side of the hot tub with a loud thud. The sound echoed through the night, and both of them scrambled to get out of the water, fear now painted clearly across their faces. "Please!" Claire screamed, trying to step between me and them, but I shoved her aside, my eyes locked on the two boys who had crossed a line they never should have. Derek was next, his hands up as he backed away, water dripping off him. "We're sorry. We didn't mean anything by it, I swear." "Sorry." I spat, advancing on them. "You're sorry? You're messing with my wife in my house, and you think sorry is going to cut it?" The rebar felt heavy in my hand, but it was nothing compared to the weight in my chest, the betrayal, the humiliation, the rage. I raised it again, my body trembling as I swung. The moment the rebar hit the ground, the tension in the air snapped. Claire screamed again, this time louder, but I barely heard her. All I could focus on was the panic in Brandon's eyes as he stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the hot tub. His face twisted in fear as he realized I wasn't bluffing. Derek wasn't faring any better, his hands still raised in surrender, his eyes wide with terror. I swung the rebar again, this time closer to Derek, making him flinch. "You think you can come into my house, touch my wife, and just walk away?" My voice was raw, trembling with rage. I took a step forward, closing the gap between us. Derek stammered, "W didn't mean anything. It was just..." "Just what?" I roared, the rebar hovering in the air, ready to strike. "Just fun? Just a mistake." Claire tried to step in front of me, her hands outstretched as if she could stop what was coming. "Please stop. Don't do this." I looked at her, disgust and disbelief flooding me. "Stop? You want me to stop now? Where was that concern for me when you were letting them put their hands all over you?" My voice cracked as the full weight of her betrayal hit me once again. "I trusted you, Claire. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me." Her lip quivered, but she said nothing. She didn't have to. Her silence said it all. Brandon, still dripping wet from the jacuzzi, made a move toward the door, trying to escape the situation. But I wasn't going to let him off that easily. I pointed the rebar at him, my hand trembling. "Where do you think you're going?" He froze, his eyes darting between me and the door, clearly calculating his next move. Derek, too, looked like he was ready to bolt, but neither of them seemed willing to risk it. I could feel their fear, smell it, almost. And God help me, it felt good. For a moment, it felt like I had control again, like I wasn't the one being humiliated. But then, Claire's sobs broke through the haze of my anger. She collapsed onto the pool deck, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with guilt and fear. "Please, please don't hurt them," she cried. The sound of her crying pierced something deep inside me. I stood there, rebar still raised, my mind a chaotic storm. The urge to lash out, to make them pay, was overwhelming. But then, just as quickly, another thought crept in. A thought that I couldn't ignore. What was I doing? This wasn't me. I wasn't a violent man. I was a husband and a father, a man who had always prided himself on being calm, rational, in control. But now, standing here, shaking with rage, I didn't recognize myself. I felt like I was spiraling, and I didn't know how to stop. Brandon and Derek were cowards, pathetic kids who had taken advantage of the situation, yes. But Claire? She had invited them into this, encouraged them. And while they deserved to be thrown out of my house and never allowed back, the real betrayal, the one that cut the deepest, was hers. I took a deep breath, my grip on the rebar loosening. My eyes burned as I looked at her crumpled form on the ground. The woman I had loved, trusted, and built a life with. Now, she was nothing more than a stranger to me. "Get out," I said, my voice low but firm. I pointed the rebar at the two boys. "Get the hell out of my house before I really lose it." They didn't need to be told twice. Derek bolted first, grabbing his clothes and running through the backyard gate, barely looking back. Brandon hesitated for a split second, his eyes flicking toward Claire. But he must have seen the warning in my face because he quickly followed after Derek, disappearing into the night. For a moment, the backyard was silent except for the soft hum of the pool filter. The glow from the pool lights cast eerie shadows across the deck, and the water rippled as if nothing had happened. As if my entire world hadn't just been turned upside down. Claire still sat on the ground, sobbing quietly into her hands. She didn't dare look up at me, and I didn't move toward her. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I tossed the rebar aside, the clang of metal on concrete sounding distant, hollow. Slowly, I knelt down beside her, my voice low and cold. "Why, Claire? Why would you do this?" She sniffed, wiping at her tears, but still wouldn't meet my gaze. "I don't know. I don't know what's wrong with me," she whispered. It just happened." "That's not good enough." My voice cracked, and I hated how weak I sounded, how much I still cared. "You don't just fall into this. What did I do wrong? What made you throw everything away?" Her shoulders shook as she let out another sob. "It wasn't you. It wasn't anything you did. But I've been feeling lost. I don't know who I am anymore." She finally looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen." "Sorry?" I echoed, my voice hollow. "You think saying sorry is going to fix this?" She reached for my hand, but I jerked away, standing up abruptly. Just don't. I backed away from her, the disgust and hurt washing over me in waves. She wasn't the woman I had married. She wasn't the mother of my son. She wasn't the person I had spent over 2 decades of my life with. She was someone else entirely, someone I didn't even know anymore. And maybe I didn't want to. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the house, leaving her alone by the pool. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a heavy blanket, suffocating me, crushing me under the weight of betrayal. I made my way to the living room, collapsing onto the couch, my mind racing. How could this have happened? How had I let things get so far without noticing? And now, what the hell was I supposed to do? A million questions, but no answers. No resolution. Just pain. I sat on the edge of the couch, my head in my hands, staring blankly at the floor. The house was eerily quiet now, save for the occasional soft hiccup of Claire's sobbing from the backyard. Her cries had become background noise, something I couldn't care about anymore. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the anger, the sheer disbelief, settled over me like a suffocating fog. How could she have done this? I kept asking myself over and over again, but no answer came. There wasn't a good reason. There never would be. The woman I thought I knew was gone, and in her place was someone I could no longer trust, no longer love. I stood up, running a hand through my hair, my thoughts racing. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't be around her, not after what I'd seen, what I'd heard. Every inch of this house, of our life, felt tainted. Staying here with her, trying to salvage what was left, was out of the question. There was only one thing I could do now, I marched upstairs, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. I could still hear her faint crying outside as I pushed open the door to Josh's room. He was sprawled out on his bed, passed out, his clothes still on. His girlfriend had long since left, probably sensing the tension in the air. For a moment, I hesitated, looking at him. My son, my only child, and I had no idea how he'd take this. But I couldn't leave him behind. He didn't need to be in this house, surrounded by the chaos his mother had created. I wouldn't let him witness any more of this destruction. "Josh," I said quietly, shaking him gently. "Wake up, son." He stirred, groaning as he blinked his bleary eyes open. "Dad? What time is it?" he mumbled, rubbing his face. "It doesn't matter. We need to go." My voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Josh sat up, his face scrunched in confusion. "Go? But what's going on?" I took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "Your mother, she did something. Something unforgivable." I swallowed hard, my voice catching. "I'm leaving, and I need you to come with me." He blinked, his confusion deepening. What are you talking about? What did Mom do?" The last thing I wanted was for him to know the full extent of his mother's betrayal. I couldn't bring myself to tell him, not like this. Not yet. But he deserved some truth. "Betrayed me, Josh. She crossed a line, and I can't stay here anymore." He sat there, wide-eyed and stunned, the weight of my words sinking in. "Betrayed? What do you mean? Did she cheat on you?" I nodded, my jaw clenched, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Yeah. With some of your friends." The silence that followed was suffocating. Josh's eyes widened in disbelief, his face pale. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me as if I had slapped him. Then, slowly, the anger began to creep into his expression. "With my friends?" His voice was a low growl, thick with shock and disgust. "Which ones?" "Brandon. Derek," I said, the names bitter in my mouth. "I caught them with her tonight." He jumped out of bed, pacing around the room, his hands running through his hair. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "How could she?" "I don't know," I said softly, my voice hollow. "But we can't stay here. Pack a bag. We're leaving tonight." He didn't argue. He grabbed his backpack and started stuffing clothes into it, his movements mechanical, like he was on autopilot. I did the same, grabbing a few things from my room, throwing them into a duffel bag. The entire time, Claire's muffled sobs drifted through the open windows, and with every sound, my anger only deepened. I couldn't face her right now. Not yet. As I zipped up the duffel bag, I heard her footsteps behind me. She had come back inside, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please don't leave. Don't do this." I ignored her, heading downstairs, but she followed me, her pleas growing louder, more desperate. "Don't leave me, please. I made a mistake. I know I screwed up, but we can fix this. We can work through it." I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, my hands gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Work through it," I said, my voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "You think we can just work through what you did? You think a few sorries are going to erase the fact that you let our son's friends touch you, kiss you? That you let them—" I broke off, the words too bitter to say aloud. Claire collapsed onto the floor, her sobs loud and uncontrollable now. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. Please don't leave me." I whirled around to face her, my chest heaving. "If you hadn't done this, Claire, we wouldn't be here right now." My voice boomed through the empty house, making her flinch. "You threw it all away. For what? For a fling with a couple of kids? You didn't just hurt me. You've humiliated me, humiliated our son. How could you be so selfish?" She sobbed harder, her hands reaching out for me. "I don't know why I did it. I don't know what's wrong with me. Please, I can change. I'll do anything. Just, please don't leave." The sight of her, broken and begging, would have torn me apart once. But now, all I felt was emptiness. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing left to say. The damage was done, and it was irreparable. Josh appeared at the top of the stairs, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked down at his mother, his face hard, unreadable. "I'm ready, Dad," he said quietly. I nodded, my throat tight. "Let's go." As we walked toward the door, Claire crawled after us, her cries becoming more frantic. "Please, please, don't leave me. I'll do anything. Don't take Josh. Please, don't take him from me." I stopped in the doorway, turning to look at her one last time. "You made your choice, Claire," I said, my voice cold and final. "Now you have to live with it." She collapsed into a heap, her sobs echoing through the house as we stepped outside. I could hear her wailing, pleading for forgiveness, but it didn't reach me. I was done. We were done. As I closed the door behind us, I glanced at Josh. He was silent, staring straight ahead, his face pale and unreadable. Neither of us said a word as we walked toward the car. There was nothing left to say. I started the engine, pulling out of the driveway, leaving behind the life I thought I knew, the life that had been shattered beyond repair. We left the house in a rush, the sound of Claire's sobs echoing through the empty hallway as we slammed the door behind us. My chest felt tight, my mind a chaotic storm of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. Josh followed me in silence, his face pale and blank, still processing everything I had just told him. The air outside was cool, but it did nothing to calm the heat of my fury. I threw our bags into the car, my movements sharp and angry, trying to burn off some of the energy that was boiling inside me. Josh stood by the passenger door, staring back at the house, at his mother, unsure of what to do or even what to think. "Get in the car," I barked, my voice harsher than I intended. He flinched but didn't argue, sliding into the passenger seat while I slammed the trunk shut. Claire's wails grew louder, desperate. I glanced back through the window and saw her stumbling out of the front door, barefoot, her hair a tangled mess, her face streaked with tears. She looked like a woman broken, shattered by her own choices. But even in her misery, all I could feel was rage. I climbed into the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. My mind was still reeling from what I had seen. The image of her in that jacuzzi, wrapped around them, burned into my brain, replaying over and over again like a nightmare I couldn't escape. "Wait!" Claire's voice cut through the stillness as she ran toward the car, her bare feet slapping against the pavement. "Please, don't go." I started the engine, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't bear to see her face, knowing what she had done, knowing she had destroyed everything we had built. Josh stared at me wide-eyed and tense. "Dad, maybe we should—" "Don't," I cut him off sharply. "We're leaving. Now." Claire reached the side of the car, banging her fists on the driver's window, her face contorted in anguish. "Please, don't take Josh. Please, don't leave me like this." Her voice cracked, the desperation thick in her words. I rolled down the window just enough for her to hear me, my voice cold and unforgiving. "You made your choice, Claire. You did this." "I made a mistake," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I know I messed up, but we can fix this. We can make it right." "Make it right?" I spat, finally turning to look at her. "You think you can just erase what you did? Do you think sorry is going to fix the fact that you slept with our son's friends? That you let them touch you in our house, in front of me?" Her knees buckled as if my words had physically hit her. She fell to the ground, clutching the side of the car, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll change. I'm so sorry, just don't take him away from me." I could feel my blood boiling again, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard it hurt. "If you hadn't done this, we wouldn't be here," I growled, my voice shaking with the weight of my anger. "You broke us, Claire. You broke everything." She clung to the side of the car, her cries becoming more frantic, more pitiful. "Don't leave me. Please. I'll do anything. Just don't leave." Josh shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale, his expression torn. He was looking at his mother, the woman who had raised him, broken and sobbing on the ground. I knew what he was feeling. Part of him wanted to comfort her, to believe her promises. But another part of him was disgusted, repelled by what she had done, just like I was. I glanced at him, my heart heavy. "You coming, son?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away, his eyes still locked on Claire. After a moment, he nodded, though he didn't look at me. "Yeah, I'm coming." I slammed the car into gear and pulled out of the driveway, leaving Claire sobbing on the pavement, her cries fading into the distance as we sped away. My chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The car was silent except for the low hum of the engine and the sound of the wind rushing past the windows. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, but I didn't know how to break it. I didn't know what to say. Josh stared out the window, his face pale and drawn. I could see the pain in his eyes, the confusion, the anger. He had just lost his mother in the worst possible way, and I didn't know how to help him. I didn't even know how to help myself. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Josh asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. I didn't want to think about Claire. I didn't want to care if she was okay or not. But Josh still did. He was still her son, after all. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know what she'll do now." He nodded, but his face remained blank, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. We drove in silence for a few more minutes before Josh finally spoke again. "Do you think we'll ever go back?" I clenched my jaw, my eyes focused on the road ahead. "No," I said firmly. "We're not going back." There was no going back. Not after what she had done. We drove for what felt like hours, though it had only been a few miles. The silence was deafening, but neither Josh nor I dared to break it. His face remained turned toward the window, his expression distant, as if he was somewhere far away. I couldn't blame him. This was a nightmare, one neither of us had expected, let alone knew how to deal with. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where we were going, or what came next. All I knew was that we couldn't stay in that house, couldn't stay with her. The betrayal was too fresh, the wound too deep. We pulled into the parking lot of a small diner, the neon sign buzzing in the otherwise quiet night. The place was nearly empty, a perfect place to collect our thoughts. I turned off the engine and glanced at Josh, who hadn't moved or spoken since we left the house. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's get something to eat." He blinked, slowly turning his head to face me. "I'm not hungry." "I know," I replied, my voice low. "But we need to think. Figure out what we're going to do." He sighed heavily but nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt and following me inside. The diner was dimly lit, the soft hum of conversation coming from a few patrons scattered at the booths. We found a table near the back, away from the others. A waitress came by, handing us menus, but I barely glanced at mine. My mind was still stuck on everything that had happened, replaying Claire's desperate cries over and over. "What are we going to do now, Dad?" Josh's voice was small, uncertain. He stared down at the menu, though I could tell he wasn't really reading it. I leaned back in the booth, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But we can't go back. Not after what she did." Josh nodded, his eyes still downcast. "I can't believe her," he muttered, his voice shaking slightly. "How could she do that? How could she ruin everything?" I didn't have an answer for him. How could she? I had asked myself the same thing over and over since that moment by the jacuzzi. The image of her wrapped around those boys, letting them touch her like that, laughing in their arms, it made my blood boil every time it crossed my mind. "I don't know," I said quietly. "I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't." The waitress came back, and we ordered something simple, coffee for me and a soda for Josh. Neither of us had much of an appetite, but we needed something to keep us grounded. After she left, I looked at Josh again. He seemed so lost, so hurt. The pain in his eyes mirrored my own, and it tore me apart to see him like this. "She didn't even try to explain," he said suddenly, his voice tight. "She just begged. She didn't even try to make it right." "There's nothing she could have said to make it right," I replied, my voice harsher than I intended. "She crossed a line, Josh. A line you can't come back from." He nodded slowly, his lips pressing together as if he was trying to keep himself from saying more. I could see the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, the disbelief still gripping him tightly. He had always seen his mother as someone invincible, someone who could never do any wrong. But now, that image had been shattered, and I wasn't sure how he was going to piece it back together. The waitress brought our drinks, and we sat in silence for a few more minutes, sipping quietly. My mind wandered to what came next, where we would go, what we would do. We couldn't stay at a motel forever, but I couldn't go back to that house. Not while Claire was still there. I didn't want to see her, couldn't stand to be near her. "Maybe we can stay with Grandma for a while," Josh suggested suddenly, breaking the silence. "Just until we figure things out." I blinked, surprised by the suggestion. My mother lived a few towns over, and while it wasn't ideal, it was better than nothing. I hadn't thought about calling her yet, hadn't thought about explaining what had happened. But Josh was right. We needed a place to stay, and right now, that was the best option. I think that's a good idea, I said slowly. It'll give us some space. Some time to think. Josh nodded again, and I could see a little bit of the tension ease from his shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small step toward figuring out what came next. As I reached for my phone to call my mother, it buzzed in my hand. I glanced at the screen. Her name flashed across the display, and for a moment I just stared at it. The phone buzzed again, a voicemail icon appearing as her call went to missed. Then another text came through, her words desperate and pleading. Please, let me talk to you. I can explain. I clenched my jaw, my thumb hovering over the delete button. I didn't want to hear her excuses. I didn't want to hear her try to explain away what she had done. But part of me, a small, quiet part, wondered if I should listen. If there was something more that I needed to hear before I could close this chapter for good. I glanced at Josh. He was staring at his drink, lost in his thoughts, not paying attention to me. I hesitated for a moment longer, then finally hit delete. I couldn't do it. Not now. Maybe not ever. I put the phone down and took a deep breath. I'm going to call Grandma, see if we can stay there for a bit. Josh nodded absently, still staring into his soda. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the pain. This was breaking him, and I hated that there was nothing I could do to make it easier. I dialed my mother's number, and after a few rings, she picked up. Her voice was warm, familiar, and for a moment, I felt like a kid again, reaching out to her for comfort. Hey, Mom, I said, my voice tight. I need a favor. She immediately sensed that something was wrong. What's going on? She asked, her tone filled with concern. Are you okay? Not really, I admitted, the words catching in my throat. I need a place to stay. Me and Josh. Just for a little while. There was a pause on the other end, but I could hear the understanding in her voice when she spoke again. Of course. Come over whenever you need to. The door's always open. Thanks, Mom, I said, relief washing over me. We'll be there soon. I hung up the phone and turned to Josh. Grandma says we can stay with her. Let's finish up and head over there. He nodded, but his expression didn't change. He was still reeling from everything that had happened, and I knew it would be a long time before he could process it all. But for now, we had a plan. A way forward. As we left the diner and got back into the car, I couldn't help but glance at my phone again, half expecting another message from Claire. But it stayed silent. And maybe that was for the best. I started the engine, pulling out of the parking lot and heading toward my mother's house. The road stretched out ahead of us, and though the future was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. There was no going back.